Okay, so today we're going to deal with shallow marine processes and depositional systems and the stratigraphy that we associate with them. So in terms of the models that we introduced yesterday, these standard sequence stratigraphic models, it's the yellow deposits within here, the shallow marine deposits we're going to focus on. And of course they occur within basins that have a shelf break margin, but they also occur within basins that have a ramp type geometry. Okay, so typically when we think about shallow marine systems, the most common way of classifying those systems is using a triangular diagram like the one on the screen here. And the corners of a triangle relate to the dominant processes. So wave processes, tides, and fluvial or river mouth processes. Those three processes define the corners of the triangle. And then within the space, the main body of the triangle, we have a number of different environments where a certain combination of those three processes occurs. So for example, deltas tend to occur near the fluvial corner. When we look towards the wave dominated corner, we're looking at barrier islands, lagoons, strand plains. We look at the tide dominated corner, we're thinking about estuaries and tidal flats. If we look at a schematic plan view map of these different environments, well, this diagram shows two such maps. So the top half of the diagram is showing transgressive or retreating shorelines and different types of shoreline in there. The bottom half of the diagram is showing progradational regressive shorelines that are building outwards, and the main shoreline types associated with that. So we can see deltas, tidal flats, and strand plains. Those are all types of shorelines which are typically progradational or regressive. The top part of the diagram, we see estuaries, tidal flats, and barrier islands. And those are the types of shorelines which are predominantly transgressive in origin. So one thing to note here is, there's a range of different environments that we associate with different combinations of processes in shallow marine rocks. We also recognize that a transgressive coastline can look rather different from a regressive coastline. Why does that matter if we're thinking about characterizing for exploration or production shallow marine rocks? Well, this diagram here explains some of that. This is sort of again, it's a cartoon that shows a river system feeding different types of shoreline. It's a bit of a strange cartoon. So so 1/3 of the diagram shows tidal flats, also tide dominated shorelines. The middle third of the diagram shows river dominated shorelines or deltas. And then the third on the right is showing wave dominated shorelines, so strand plains or barrier islands mainly. And the thing to look at here is the yellow units within here, which basically represent sand bodies associated with those different environments. And the key thing is those sand bodies have different extents in terms of their area. They have a different configuration in terms of where the sand is distributed. So distributary mouth bars, those are associated with the ends of distributary channels in river dominated deltas. They tend to be pretty small and isolated from each other. In contrast, if we're looking at wave dominated shorelines, they tend to be laterally extensive, so along the strike parallel to the shoreline, and they also tend to be extensive in a dip direction as we go from the shoreline and move offshore. So there's some big differences in the dimensions and the arrangement of these different sand bodies depending on the process. And that's why it's important to characterize them from a reservoir perspective. Okay, so now we're going to focus for the rest of this little lecture on wave dominated shorelines and parasequences. So those are the the smallest sequence stratigraphic units that we typically consider within the models we talked about yesterday. So in terms of this triangular classification, that's the bottom left corner, barrier islands and strand plains. And this diagram of transgressive and regressive coastlines in map view, the strand plane is a regressive component. You can see it's colored yellow. It's really a sheet of sand that extends parallel to the coastline. Barrier islands have transgressive equivalents. They have lagoons behind them. They kind of have narrower geometries, and there's some more complex elements within them. So one common thing, whether we're thinking about a barrier island or a strand plane, is that once we look at the part that's underwater, it has a very similar geometry. So if I go back to this diagram, we're looking at the front of the barrier island or the front of the strand plane. If we take a cross section perpendicular to the shoreline, this is what we see. Here the waves are breaking. This is the shallowest part of the system, and as we move offshore, well, but the seabed dips in a seaward direction, so we move into progressively deeper water, and the angle of dip of the shore of the profile becomes less. So this profile is steep in shallow water, and it becomes gradually less steep as we move into deeper water. Okay, so in this case, waves are the dominant process. So we can look at waves on the surface in here. Those waves are formed by wind blowing across the surface of a lake or an ocean. They generate these waves, and the depth to which those waves will interact with the water column is half of the wavelength at the surface, and that defines basically wave base. And we typically think about two types of waves. We think about fair weather waves. So those are the waves that act day to day all the time. Small waves with a small wavelength, and that means those waves interact with the seabed only to a relatively shallow depth. And we can define that depth as fair weather wave base. That's the depth. Above that depth, we expect that those fair weather waves can move sediment around. However, we also have storms. So those could be winter storms, or they could be tropical hurricanes. Those generate much larger waves, much larger wavelengths, and therefore those large wavelength waves, their impact extends a lot deeper in the water column down to storm wave base in here. Okay. So if we think about moving from the deepest part of this profile and moving to a shallower part of the profile, well, if at the deepest part, if we're below storm wave base, effectively we expect no influence of storm waves or of fair weather waves. We might expect to just accumulate fine-grained mud and silt settling from suspension. In between fair weather and storm waves, well, that would correspond to the lower part of the shore face. In here, we expect to see the effects of storm events, and then in between those storm events, we have long periods of quiet conditions below fair weather wave base. So here we expect to see, the effects of, storm events rather infrequent, and then long periods of not very much happening in between those. Once we move into shallower water above the fair weather wave base, this then becomes the upper part of the shore face. And here we see the effects of waves that are acting all the time, these fair weather waves. That can generate bars. We'll say more about those, and those bars can migrate, move laterally along the shore face. And then the waves spill over and they break against the foreshore or the beach. That's associated with the highest energy in this shore face system. This is what we might imagine standing on if we're by a coastline. We see the waves breaking, and we have a flat surface that dips gently towards the sea. So that's a sort of an idealized cross section through a shore face. key things here is that fair weather waves, they tend to move sand onto the shore face and the upper part of the shore face. The upper part of the shore face, maybe let me move back to this diagram in here. The waves in here, they become asymmetrical. That's because the waves are encountering friction on the seabed. That kind of slows up the front of the waves as they're moving onshore, and that can cause them to become asymmetrical. Asymmetrical waves then are capable of generating ripples and dunes, which can migrate. Those waves do not have to approach directly onto the shore face. They can approach the shoreline at an angle. I'll show you some examples of that later on. Where the waves break, that's where they spill over onto the beach or the foreshore. They produce this very flat parallel lamination. Storm waves, these big waves, they tend to strip off sand from the upper shore face, and they either move it landward, so into a lagoon, for example, or they move it offshore in this range of depths between fair weather and storm wave base. So yeah, so those storm waves tend to strip sand and move it around off the upper part of the shore face. And storm waves are associated with some diagnostic structures, diagnostic sedimentary structures that record, these large oscillating waves operating during storms. And the influence of fair weather and storm waves, that depends on water depth. We've seen that in the last diagram. The shallower part of the section is dominated by the effects of fair weather waves, and as we move into deeper water, we see that storm waves become the dominant process. So what do we expect to see then overall? Well, this is a cartoon showing the effects of the vertical succession that builds up through the migration of this profile in here. So in a vertical sense, as this profile moves out, it moves from left to right. We'll deposit first the deposits below storm wave base, then we deposit in between storm and fair weather wave base, and then we deposit the shallowest section, fair weather wave base, above fair weather wave base. So that will be a regressive succession. So first of all, we see below storm wave base, we see effectively fine-grained mudstones. Then above there, we start to see interbedding of sandstones and mudstones. The sandstone beds here, they represent these periods when the storms are bringing sand into relatively deep water. And then the fair weather periods in between those storms are marked by deposition of fine-grained material. And as we move up into shallower water, what we tend to see is that the effects of the storms become more pronounced, and the effects of the fair weather periods in between the storms become less pronounced. So we see, more sand, and that sand becoming thicker, beds becoming amalgamated, stacked vertically on top of each other. And once we get into the shallowest part of the section, upper shore face on here, then we start to see different sedimentary structures, and I'll show some examples of those in the next few slides. And then the very top in here, well, once we get to the shallowest part of this succession, this diagram in here, so from the bottom up until this point in here, we're getting progressively shallower, and then at this point in here, we go back into deeper water deposits, so below storm wave base. So that's recording flooding across the top of that succession. Okay, in plan view, this is a picture of a modern wave-dominated delta. So here, this is off the coast of Brazil. Here's the river feeding sediment to the delta. But if we look off to the sides, we see these broad areas of a relatively either linear or very gently curved shoreline on both flanks of the delta. We can see the former positions of the shoreline, these stripes in here, and we can see that those shorelines are also very gently curved. And those shorelines, they build out by basically transport of sand from the river mouth by the action of waves, and that sand then gets plastered along this rather linear or gently curved shoreline. And if you take a cross section across there, we would see our shore face profile. This would be an example of a strand plane. Okay, so a very sandy succession, gently curved shape to the shoreline, and fed by the longshore transport of sediment, which originally came from rivers. So let's look at some real examples of rocks through that vertical succession. So here we're going in grey. In here we have these offshore deposits, so below storm wave base, and as we pass upwards we start to see these rather thin, resistant yellow beds appearing. These are storm event beds. There's a person, well, two people here for scale. So the height of this cliff face is about 30 meters. So here we're going from offshore into the lower part of the shore face, where we're seeing interbedded storm sandstone beds and fair weather mudstone beds. If we look at one of those sandstone beds, this is what we tend to see. They tend to be a few tens of centimeters in thickness. They're separated by mudstones, although you can still see there's some thin sandstone beds in here. So we're seeing evidence for some big storms represented by the thick sandstone beds, and some smaller storms represented by the thinner sandstone beds. We look at one of those beds in detail, we see Hummucky cross stratification. So let me first show you an example of what that looks like. Here is one of the sandstone beds. We see these concave upward erosion surfaces within the bed. And if you look at lamination within the bed, we see that lamination is basically, it's parallel. It's draping over these erosion surfaces. And this structure looks similar if we took a cross section at 90 degrees. So this sedimentary structure does not have a preferred orientation, and this is what we mean by Hummucky cross stratification. How does that form? Okay, so what this diagram here is showing, this graph at the top is showing offshore versus onshore direction of flow at the seabed, and zero means basically no flow, and as we move either up or down, we're having a higher velocity in a particular direction at the seabed. The horizontal axis is time, so on the left we basically have zero time, and as we pass towards the right we have a greater progressive amount of time. And what you can see on here, what this graph shows is the velocity at the seabed as a storm passes over that particular part of the seabed. And waves are characterized by this backwards and forwards motion. So what you can see, big storm waves, large amplitude, sort of low frequency to that back and forth motion. We have this sinusoidal curve, and that records the velocity at the seabed. And the total duration of a hurricane might be in the order of several hours to maybe a couple of days. So if you imagine being at some part of a seabed, there are times when that seabed undergoes a peak in velocity, very high velocity. And at those times, the velocity is sufficiently high that we can actually erode the seabed. We can erode mud on the seabed. Any mud or sand is carried suspended within the water column, and effectively we generate an erosion surface. And that's what's shown by these very high peaks in velocity in here. But what we also see as we move from the peak of the storm and pass towards the back end of the storm, we see these peaks in velocity become gradually lower. So think about what happens as we go from one of these peaks down towards a period of zero for low velocity. Well, we have all this sand being transported, carried in suspension in the water column. As we go from a peak in velocity down to zero, that sand can settle from suspension, and it can form a sort of a drape over the erosion surface of the seabed. We then move to the next peak in velocity and we have some more erosion. that erosion maybe doesn't erode all the way to the base of the bed, so we still preserve some of the sand we've just deposited, but we generate a large sort of symmetrical erosion surface, and that would be one of those erosion surfaces in the Hummucky cross stratification. So we generate one of these sort of up and down erosion surfaces with a wavelength of in the order of a meter or more. Okay, we then go to the next point of zero flow velocity and we deposit another series of parallel laminated sand that drapes the underlying erosion surface. We then go to the next peak, we cut another one of these undulating erosion surfaces. The next period of zero flow velocity, we deposit a series of laminae that drape over that erosion surface. And what we build up through time is basically a series of these erosion surfaces, which have this undulating geometry, and packages of laminae in between there, which are parallel to those erosion surfaces. And this is what we think of as, or what we characterize as Hummucky cross stratification. Once we get to the very end of the storm, we generate just small ripples at the top of the bed. That's characterized by these very small peaks in velocity. And eventually we go back to zero flow velocity and finer grain materials settling from suspension over the top of the bed. There's also scope there for animals to colonize the seabed once the storm has passed over. So in an idealized bed, we have an erosion surface. We might have some coarse grain material lining that erosion surface that's too coarse to be picked up by the storm waves. Above that, we have Hummucky cross stratification, and then the top of the bed we have wave ripples and biotubation. These sort of wiggly lines are indicating burrows. And that's what we're seeing in this diagram here. Okay, as other things we see in here, well, here are some more examples of Hummucky cross stratified sandstone beds, so storm event beds separated by mudstones. You can also see in here there's some big sort of channelized features. So here's the erosional base of one of those channels. You can see it has a kind of a stepped side. Here's another example of one of those channels scoured deeply down. So these steep-sided scours are referred to as gutter casts, and they're also an expression of deep erosion at the peak of these storms. Okay, as we move up into shallower water, we start to see beds which are Hummucky cross stratified. Those are these ones with the clearer lamination, and they alternate with biotubated intervals, which really represent the tops of these beds in between the storms. Then we go back into another laminated interval, another Hummucky cross stratified bed, then another biotubated interval. If we zoom in, this is one of those Hummucky cross stratified beds. Here's a photo of the biotubation at the bed top, and there's the next storm event bed. So in this case, we're still in the lower part of the shore face. Storms are still dominant, but in this case, each storm is able to erode out the mudstones deposited during the previous fair weather period between storms. So the only real evidence for those periods in between the storms are the burrows that record basically having a stable seabed. Okay, we then move up into the shallower part of the section and we see a change into trough or tabular crossbedding. So that's what's being picked out here. So these trough and tabular crossbedding, these record dunes migrating. And these dunes are moved by fair weather waves. So that can seem a bit counterintuitive. How can waves going backwards and forwards, how can they generate dunes which migrate in a single direction? Okay, so let me try and explain that. So this diagram here is a map. We're seeing the beach or the foreshore, that's where the waves are breaking. And as we go from there towards the bottom of the image, we're going into progressively deeper water. There's two parts of this diagram. The one on the left-hand side, the waves are approaching the shoreline basically head-on. So the arrows in here are oriented at 90 degrees to the shoreline. The waves are approaching the shoreline head on. When that happens, once the waves break on the shore face, the foreshore, sorry, some of that water gets transported to the sides and we set up these circulation cells. We can't just keep on adding water. It has to escape back to the open ocean again. And it does that by setting out these, or moving sideways along the upper shore face and then moving offshore through rip currents that occupy shallow channels. So if the waves approach head on, we tend to see currents which are oriented parallel to the shoreline, but in two directions. And we also see currents that move back out to sea as well. If the waves approach at an angle, so what's labeled here as a oblique wave approach on the right-hand side of the diagram, the waves are approaching the shoreline at an angle, well, that sets up a current which flows parallel to the shoreline. And that current is continuous. It can continue for a long distance along the shoreline. That current flows in one direction, and that can be sufficiently strong to generate dunes, which again move in one direction, and that gives us a eddy current which is parallel to the shoreline. So I hope this diagram explains how waves can generate dunes and how we can generate currents or eddy currents that move in one direction, as I just showed you on this photograph here. Okay, we move even higher up the succession. This is the very top of our shore face succession. There's a change from trough and tabular crossbeds at the bottom of this image into just parallel laminated beds. And those record where the waves are breaking. So effectively, this is the equivalent of standing on the beach and seeing a nice flat surface dipping gently out to sea. That's expressed as these planar laminations. And in this case, there's a coal with roots indicating plants growing on top of the shore face. Just a few examples of what this looked like in core. So the image on the left is showing some ripple laminated sands with burrows through there. So these are examples of thin storm beds with the burrows representing periods in between the storms, animals colonizing the seabed. So this would be the equivalent of these stacked storm event beds, but with burrows recording the fair weather periods in between the storms. We also see in this middle photograph places where we see, remember our core is quite narrow, just maybe 6 or 7 centimeters across. We see packages of laminations which are parallel. Then there's a break in angle of just a few degrees, some more parallel laminated, another parallel laminated unit, another break in angle, another parallel laminated unit. This is what Hummucky cross stratification looks like in core. If I jump back in the slides to this example in here, if you imagine taking a thin strip through the middle of that bed, you can imagine you see some parallel laminated intervals, a surface with a slight change in angle, some parallel laminations, a change in angle, some parallel laminations, which is basically what we're seeing in this central core in here. Okay, so the idea here, if I try and summarize the model we've talked through, we have a shore face building out. In this case, it's building out from left to right. That shore face is sitting in front of a strand plane, if this is a regressive coastline. We can imagine if sea level starts to rise, that we can't supply enough sediment to keep up with that rise in sea level, that increase in accommodation. So what happens then? Well, we can no longer maintain the strand plane, and in fact the waves start to rework some of the sediment from the strand plane, and they form a small raised feature. This is basically a barrier island, and there's a lagoon behind that. So the barrier island and lagoon start to form when the shoreline is retreating or transgressive. The next stage in here, we carry on raising sea level, again faster than we can supply sediment. The barrier island becomes better developed and it continues to retreat towards the left in a landward direction. The lagoon also continues to develop. The fourth diagram in here, well, sea level is now stable. So what that means is that we can start to infill the lagoon. We have more sediment than we have accommodation space being generated. So firstly, we infill the lagoon. We still have our river system in here. It's still supplying sediment, and now it's infilling the lagoon. And this last picture here, so once the lagoon's been infilled, the river can then connect up to the front of the barrier island, and then we start to build out again. And again, we're building out as a regressive succession, which is a strand plane. Okay, there's no lagoon present during this regressive interval. So this block diagram sort of helps to explain how we go from having a strand plane to a barrier island, depending on whether we're looking at regression or transgression. So strand planes are regressive, they're well preserved. Sediment is supplied by longshore currents, so typically waves approaching the shoreline at an angle and then setting up those longshore currents parallel to the shoreline. That gives us these kind of linear or gently curved shoreline geometries. And often, you know, these strand planes, it can be difficult to say where they end and where deltas with a strong wave influence begin. There's a continuum between those two. Barrier islands are transgressive. Again, they tend to have a linear geometry because the sand is supplied by waves approaching the shoreline at an angle. They're narrow. We do also have breaks in the barrier island. So these are referred to as tidal inlets. These allow tides to move water and sediment from the open ocean into the lagoon. So even though we're thinking about a wave-dominated environment, tides are still present. So you know, we invariably have more than one process, even if one is dominant in a particular environment. Okay, the rest of this text isn't so important. So just sort of a couple of things to point out in here. So one is that this model shows one episode of regression and then a transgression associated with generating this barrier island. And you'll see that, you know, that transgression is associated with the development of a surface that basically a flooding surface that represents the drowning of that strand plane. We can also see within the regressive strand plane, we expect to see, you know, cliniforms, dipping surfaces that record the shore face at different times of the advance of the shoreline. And we can see those things if you look at ancient examples. So here's a rock succession. This cliff face is about 200 meters in height. I'm going to focus on this sandstone that's forming this prominent ledge. You can see that overlays a series of muddy rocks, mudstones in the sort of the blue-gray color. The orange color here is sandstone. Okay, let me vertically exaggerate that image by a factor of 3, so some of the geometries are clearer. So again, we have a succession here indicated by the white line where we go from mudstone, interbedded sandstones and mudstones into continuous sandstone. So this is an upward shallowing succession, and then it's capped by a change back into mudstone. So this would be a flooding surface representing a change from the top of our shoreface succession in sandstone into muddy offshore deposits. So this is a flooding surface running across the top in here. I think the next slide shows that, a flooding surface at the top. There's also a flooding surface at the bottom as we go from an upward coarsening unit, which is rather sand, doesn't have much sand in. an abrupt increase in mud content to a second upward shallowing unit or parasequence. Now, one thing we can see in here, if we trace out some of these beds, here's one, we trace it out parallel. We can see, we trace it out from right to left. We can see it actually over on the right, it's about a third of the way up the succession between the blue lines, the flooding surfaces. As we go towards the left, you can see it starts to climb upwards. So over here, it's about 2/3 of the way up from the lower to the upper flooding surface. So, and then we can't easily trace that surface any further because it has sand above and sand below. So let me draw on the interpretation there. In red, we have this dipping surface. So that dipping surface, that's basically the shore face. That's the expression of the shore face. It's present, but it has a very gentle dip, very much less than 1 degree. So it's quite subtle. Okay, I'm going to stop there. That's the end of our wave-dominated shallow marine sort of summary.